Vladivostok didn't fall to an army. It vanished while no one was looking. Russia's gateway to the Pacific wasn't conquered. It was absorbed, asset by asset, street by street. No tanks crossed the border. No missiles were fired. And yet today, Moscow no longer controls its own eastern frontier. This isn't a future warning. This is the moment the map stopped matching reality. Today, at MRwarfare, we reveal how Russia lost a city without ever losing a battle. Not the version being sold to the public, but the moment the Kremlin never wanted exposed. Because this didn't happen suddenly. It didn't happen loudly. And that's exactly why it worked. While the world was watching explosions in Ukraine, something far quieter was unfolding in the East. No headlines. No emergency sessions. No declarations. Just paperwork changing hands. Just ports rerouting cargo. Just currencies quietly replacing each other. And that raises a dangerous question most people aren't asking. How does a state lose control of a strategic city without triggering alarms, not even inside its own government? The answer isn't invasion. It's gravity. Economic gravity. Demographic gravity. And the kind of neglect that only becomes visible once it's irreversible. By the time Moscow realized what was happening, there was nothing left to defend. Because sovereignty had already moved silently, legally, and permanently. What happened in Vladivostok isn't just about one city. It's a blueprint, a model for how power shifts in the 21st century, without wars, without treaties, and without resistance. And once you see how it happened here, you'll start noticing the same pattern in places the world still assumes are stable. That's where this story is going. On paper, Vladivostok still looks Russian. The signs are in Russian. The flag still flies. The port still answers officially to Moscow. But walk through the city early in the morning, before the headlines wake up, and the illusion starts to crack. At the docks, cargo moves on schedules Moscow no longer controls. Shipping manifests routes south, not west. Logistics software no longer syncs cleanly with Russian systems. And the people making decisions aren't waiting for instructions from the capital. They don't need to. Because this transfer didn't begin with soldiers. It began with silence. For years, the Russian Far East was treated as distance, not responsibility. A region acknowledged on maps, but rarely in budgets. Investments slowed. Maintenance lagged. Promises stayed promises. Local industries didn't collapse all at once. They thinned out, piece by piece. Young Russians left first. Some went west. Others went anywhere else. Entire districts aged in place. Schools closed not because of policy, but because there were no children left. A city that can't replace its workers doesn't lose jobs. It loses future. And when people leave, something always follows. Vacuum. That vacuum didn't stay empty. Chinese firms arrived as partners, then as investors, then as operators. Warehouses were modernized. Ports were leased. Rail access was upgraded. None of it illegal. None of it loud. And none of it required permission. Regional development data now shows dozens of Chinese companies operating inside Vladivostok's port zones and special economic areas. Capital commitments grew steadily, not dramatically, which is why they weren't treated as threats. Russian banks adapted without resistance. Dedicated offices opened to serve Chinese clients. Settlement systems adjusted. Currency exposure shifted quietly. Banks don't realign like that unless power has already moved. And once money changes direction, control always follows. Today, major transactions in Vladivostok are no longer anchored to the ruble. Real estate, wholesale trade, port logistics, increasingly quoted in yuan. That isn't symbolism. That's surrender by arithmetic. Currencies don't replace each other because of ideology. They replace each other because trust has already shifted. Moscow understands this, but reversing it would require leverage it no longer has. Sanctions narrowed options. Export dependence deepened. Financial flexibility disappeared. In the East, China became the buyer, the lender, and the logistical backbone. Restricting Chinese firms wouldn't trigger confrontation. It would trigger consequences Russia couldn't absorb. Delayed cargo, frozen financing, rerouted trade. For a region already stretched thin, that would be fatal. And here's the detail most people overlook. Even if the war ended tomorrow, even if sanctions vanished overnight, this wouldn't reverse. Supply chains don't snap back. Trade routes don't remember loyalty. Cities don't forget who keeps them alive. By the time Moscow noticed, Vladivostok wasn't Russian in function anymore. Only on paper. And paper doesn't move power, because once demographics shift, there is no counteroffensive. Ports can be upgraded, contracts renegotiated, infrastructure repaired. But people don't rewind. For years, the Russian Far East has been emptying out. Birth rates declined. Workforces shrank. Towns aged together. The region became rich in resources and poor in residents. Meanwhile, migration quietly rewired the ground reality. Chinese workers arrived legally at first, then semi-legally, then permanently. Construction crews became supervisors. Supervisors became managers. Managers became owners. Housing followed. Retail followed. Community followed. This wasn't a surge. It was a drip. Steady. Predictable. Unstoppable. Population change doesn't announce itself. It doesn't trigger emergency meetings. It simply becomes reality 1 year at a time. Today, in key logistics corridors around Vladivostok, Russian is no longer the working language. The ruble is no longer the default reference. Decision-making no longer waits for Moscow. That isn't ideology. That's math. Once labor markets, housing, and commerce shift language and currency, sovereignty becomes inertia, not authority. Moscow doesn't just lack control. It lacks people. And a state without people cannot enforce loyalty, project power, or reverse momentum. History is unforgiving on this point. Empires don't lose territory when borders move. They lose it when populations stop belonging. By the time leaders react, the decision has already been made not in councils, but in households. Vladivostok didn't fall. It aged out of Russia. And when a state loses people before it loses land, the land is already gone. Once Vladivostok slipped out of Moscow's functional control, the consequences didn't stop at Russia's border. They spread outward. For China, this wasn't opportunism. It was resolution. A northern flank that no longer needed planning against. A Pacific gateway no longer contested. The Russian Far East became something more useful than an ally. An extension. Timber flows south. Minerals flow south. Energy flows south. What flows back isn't influence. It's dependency. This is why there were no protests, no declarations, no formal annexation, because none of that was necessary. The moment Moscow lost the ability to say no, the transfer was complete. On paper, Russia still maintains a Pacific fleet. On paper, Vladivostok remains a military hub. But fleets don't operate on paper. They operate on fuel deliveries, maintenance cycles, dockyard labor, rail access, all of which now move through economic systems Beijing can slow, redirect, or pressure, quietly. No blockade required. No confrontation needed. Just friction. That's the shift. Power without visibility. Control without declaration. For Washington, Tokyo, and every Pacific capital, this matters more than most want to admit. One uncertainty disappeared. China no longer has to hedge against a northern wildcard. Its strategic depth expanded not by conquest, but by neglect. While Russia concentrated west, it erased itself from the Pacific balance. And once a power fades from relevance, it doesn't get invited back. Not by allies. Not by rivals. Not by history. Vladivostok wasn't lost because China is stronger. It was lost because Russia stopped showing up. Empires don't collapse when an enemy storms the gate. They collapse when the center becomes distracted, exhausted, and overextended. For years, the Far East survived on inertia. And inertia only works until something else pulls harder. When young Russians left, no replacements arrived. When industries decayed, alternatives didn't follow. When infrastructure aged, funding stalled. The vacuum wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. And administrative vacuums invite systems, not soldiers. China didn't threaten. It didn't pressure. It offered what Moscow no longer could: jobs, capital, stability, planning. At first, it looked temporary. Then it looked normal. Then it became irreversible. Stopping it would have required attention, resources, and leverage that were already committed elsewhere. So nothing was done. And in geopolitics, doing nothing is often the most decisive act of all. Because when a state stops defending relevance, relevance moves on without it. This is why Vladivostok isn't just a Russian story. It's a prototype. A demonstration of how territory can be lost in the 21st century without a single battle. No invasion headlines. No emergency summits. No tanks in the streets. Just a slow transfer of dependence. The world is full of places that still look stable on a map, but are already hollow underneath. Places where populations shrink, where economies survive on subsidies, where infrastructure ages faster than it's repaired, where attention is focused somewhere louder. Those places don't fall, they fade. And fading is dangerous because it doesn't trigger alarms. By the time anyone notices, the map has already changed. Ukraine didn't just drain resources. It consumed attention, focus, political oxygen. While eyes stayed west, the east was quietly reclassified. From strategic asset to economic appendage. China understood something crucial. You don't confront a distracted power. You wait. And waiting, when paired with investment, is enough. So here's the question that matters now. How many places still look sovereign on paper, but already survive on someone else's? Permission? Because once dependence shifts, control follows. Quietly, functionally, irreversibly. We don't chase narratives. We track where systems fail. Stay sharp. Thanks for watching.